On this episode of Locked On Lightning, we're continuing our player reviews of this past season. And on today's episode, we take a look at Conor Sheary, pushing the reset button on Sheary this offseason. We take a look at, can they pull off a deal this offseason by getting him on another team and out of some more cap space? All that coming up and more on Locked On Lightning.
You're Locked On Lightning, your daily podcast on the Tampa Bay Lightning, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome to another episode of Locked On Lightning, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Adam Danker. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Locked On Lightning. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. On this episode, we're continuing our player review segment. We've taken past looks at Brandon Hagel, Nick Paul, a bunch of players on this team as we round out the depth players. We're talking about Conor Sheary on today's episode. We're talking about his past season, his first season with the Lightning, how much of a disappointment that was. We also take a look at this season. Can the Lightning part ways with him? We talk about that as well and round up things with, as we always do, with our expectations for next season. If he's here, what do we expect out of him? Before we grab any of those topics, please go ahead and subscribe to the podcast. Give us a follow wherever podcasts are distributed in audio form. We're also available on YouTube. Subscribe to our channel there. Hit that notification button so as soon as the new episode drops, you'll be notified. So this was an interesting, as really they all are. This was an interesting topic that that has really been on my mind since we started these player reviews way back when with Nick Paul to start the offseason. And Conor Sheary is one of those topics. The reason why I'm so, I guess, looking forward to it as well as not, because it's one of those things where with any player that underperforms in my eyes on this team is I try to toe the line between being absolutely truthful as well as not trying to dump on these guys. Obviously, these guys are professionals and they know as well as anybody else if whether or not they lived up to expectations this season. And I guess that's where we could really start things off here with the Conor Sheary conversation is, did he live up to expectations this season, his first season in Tampa Bay? Well, let's take a look at the stats. 57 games played, 4 goals, 15 points. Face-off percentage, obviously he's not here to win face-off, so let's not even take a look at that. But when the Lightning signed him in the offseason, I was very, very excited because you look at Conor Sheary's career, and it got off to a pretty fast start there in Pittsburgh in only his second year. 61 games played, 23 goals, 53 points. And then from there, it kind of starts, his offensive stats start to dwindle. He had a short stint in Buffalo, went back to Pittsburgh in 1920 for only 8 games, and has been in Washington leading up to his time in Pittsburgh for 3 seasons. Every year, it looks like he's starting to kind of get back on the right track of somewhat being a solid offensive guy. Obviously, what he's known for most is when he was very clutch in the playoffs for the Pittsburgh Penguins when they were winning cups. So obviously that was something that was very alluring, I think, to a lot of Lightning fans when the conversation was brought up, having him in the fold, and as well as with the Lightning being able or looking to get back into the contender conversation. You kind of figured bringing a guy like this You got him at a good time in his career where he still got some pep in his step, where he could get you points. He provides that veteran leadership, all the things that you would love to bring in with a veteran forward or just a veteran player in general. And so it brings me to the question that we're all going to be answering now. Did he live up to expectations after kind of somewhat of a resurgence out in Washington? And the answer is flat and plainly no. No. It was one of those years, and I use this for a lot of players on this team, especially this year. Especially with Sheary, where, yeah, he had his moments, and even in the playoffs against Florida, you kind of felt, well, not in the playoffs against Florida, let's scrap that, but you felt like down the line that he was really he was going to start to come on. Even though you saw that, the Lightning didn't even bother playing him in the series against Florida. But down the line, even with his injury struggles and just having one of those seasons in where you roll him out and you wouldn't even know that he was on the ice if you didn't tell me. Where most nights he played the role of the invisible man, and that's really what he was all season long. And it was really frustrating to see, all things considered, especially when you look at how things could have been changed around and how long John Cooper and this coaching staff let things go on for with Sheary. For most part this season, he was a non-factor, but even down the line, you would have kind of thought he looks like he's starting to get some spark here that is going to be able to maybe allow him to carry this over into the playoffs. Even the game against Ottawa at the beginning of April, you kind of would have figured that, all right, things are starting to turn around, and that wasn't really the case whatsoever. And it was really just a disappointing situation, because the Lightning are obviously in a situation where you can't have any dead weight whatsoever. You got to make every penny count. And I've alluded to it numerous times this season that really the Conor Sheary that we saw this year was just quite reminiscent of the previous year, which we saw out of Vlad Nemestikov, which was really nothing whatsoever. And that's what it made more frustrating, is because we've already been down this road, and a lot of you have talked about it in the YouTube comments, and you know who you are. You've done a very good job of pointing that out, and you're absolutely right. Is, for as much as we praise Julien Brisebois with some of the moves he makes, bringing in Nick Paul, Brandon Hagel, Anthony Duclair, for every good trade that he makes, that you almost think like it's starting to come together, we get an absolute dud. I don't know if it's just free agency in general, but you get an absolute dud with some of these free agent signings that it makes you wonder, like, did anybody see this coming? Is this some sort of just freak thing that happens with some free agents that come to Tampa Bay? They come here and they look like just they look like it's their first time ever playing hockey. Because really that's what we saw out of the last couple of years with Vlad Nemestikov making his return back. There was quite a bit of hype around that. And then that quickly ended on night one. And then with Conor Sheary, there was, I spoke about it before, there was a lot of optimism around that move. I didn't expect the guy to come in and score 15 goals, but 4 goals and 15 points is just, that's terrible. And then on top of that, you're not staying healthy. You don't really offer anything defensively. And you buried Tanner Jeannot on the fourth line for this guy. And it's just one of those, it's just really a head scratcher kind of thing where you kind of have to wonder, like I said, is it more on Sheary or is it more on Julien Brisebois? And it's quite frankly a year from both parties where I would think that they would love to have a redo. So if I had to give him a grade, which I have to, every player review segment that we do, I would have to give him a D-. I'm not going to be a jerk and give people Fs here. I would give Julien Brisebois an F for this signing. So I guess by extension, yes, this is an F. But Conor Sheary, I'm very understanding of injury issues, and that could have played in a part somewhat in what happened, or really, quite frankly, what didn't happen this year. So I will take that into account. But other than that, really just didn't offer anything to this team. And the fact that the Lightning are privileged to now have him for a couple more years, it makes things a little bit more complicated. Even with the salary cap going up just a little bit, and even with some money coming off the books, you still don't want to have a guy regardless with that really doesn't offer you anything there and is making $2 million a year. It also calls into question, why is Julien Brisebois dealing out no trade clause like hotcakes? I mean, I made this point years ago. You put yourself into a situation where you're giving players huge contracts where you're really financially straining yourself in the short run. And then the guys you do bring in that are really, quite frankly, not all that good, you're giving them no trade clauses. So, yeah, who's the blame here? Is it more so Julien Brisebois in this situation for bringing in Conor Sheary and putting him in a situation that maybe was not right for him? Or do we blame Conor Sheary for a poor performance and basically, I guess we could say, hustling the Lightning out of $2 million a year? Let me know in the comments below how you feel about that. And coming up in just a little bit, we're going to talk about this offseason. Can the Lightning find a deal for him? That's really been kind of a topic of conversation that we've had pretty much, I think, even before the season ended. But we'll continue to talk about it and see if maybe we could wrap our heads around something or a deal to where the Lightning could at least get this money off the books. But first, we're going to talk about one of today's sponsors on today's show. One of them is our friends over at Game Time. Now, listen, I love going out to sporting events, comedy shows, theater, wherever it be. I live in New York, so it's all around me. But I don't want to spend a lot of money, and I want to get my tickets right away. I don't want to have to wait a couple of weeks or a couple of hours, whatever the case. I want my tickets now, especially if I'm doing it last minute. And I buy all my tickets over at Game Time because Game Time makes getting tickets even faster and easier. Prices on Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to the start of your event. I love their last minute deals. You could save up to 60% off buying tickets last minute for sports, concert, comedy, theater, whatever it may be. They got the good prices for you for the events you want to go to. And I also love their Seat View. Who wants to go to an event that you paid money for, regardless of how much or how little, and you want to have an obstructed view, or you want to be sitting behind a pole? You get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy, so you get the seat that is just right for you. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDONNHL $20 off your first purchase. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed. So as always, I want to thank you all for making us your first listen of the day. If you haven't already done so, please go ahead and subscribe to the podcast. Give us a follow wherever podcasts are distributed in audio form. We're also available on YouTube. Subscribe to our channel there and comment below this video. I mean, what were your overall thoughts about Conor Sheary? If you were going to give him a grade, what would yours be? And why? Because I don't want people to just be throwing Fs down there for no reason whatsoever. And I think it the point I made at the last segment, I think it really does it does offer a good point where you could really say to yourself, is this lack thereof success, is this more so on Sheary, or is this more so on Julian Brees-Boss? You know, listen, like I said, sometimes you need to bring in guys that can be put into the right situations for them. And a guy who was put onto the third line for a majority of the season and really didn't do much of anything. You got to wonder, was this more so, like I said, Brees-Boss or even Cooper? You know, listen, Cooper isn't infallible. Okay. The guy's won 2 cups for us. That's great. I love it. He's a very good coach. You know, sometimes he's very smart and sometimes he's very stubborn. So let me know in the comments below. But right now we're talking about really the other conversation, or really the other head of the snake that we need to talk about here when it comes to talking about Conor Sheary is really that now what happens next? A lot of people, including yours truly, are really trying to figure out, can, or more so wishful thinking, can the Lightning make a deal with Conor Sheary and trade him out of Tampa Bay? And I know I said it before, he has a no trade clause, but at the same time, I think that really it's one of those things where you got to be honest with him. You got to be honest with him and say, listen, you know, we're thinking about next season already. Either you come back at a very limited role, but then again, at $2 million a year, are you really going to have this guy being scratched every other night? I think not. That's just, now you're just flushing money down the toilet at that point. But is there, it also makes me think, is there a scenario where we could bring him back and it could actually work? And my answer to that right away is no. I mean, the guy really, unless he has a resurgence of a year that, like, one we have not seen at really any other time, I mean, how is he really going to come back and be able to justify the $2 million? Because let's face it, if he sticks to the averages that he's been putting up over the last 5 years, yeah, you get about 15, 19 goals out of him, maybe 43 points, and that's great on the third line. But what are the chances of that really happening? Because you also look at his averages over the last couple of years. Yeah, he's coming off an 82-game season in 22-23, and that's phenomenal. But outside of that, he has never played a full season. Ever. That was the first time in his career that he has ever played a full season. In his 8th season in the league, that's the first time when you play a full season. And before that, he never played anything more than 78 games. So now we're having the conversation about trying to justify keeping a guy who not only is kind of starting to get into his 30s, he's going to be 32 next year, but also a guy, actually, he just turned 32 the other day, on June 8th. But now you're talking about a guy that may or may not be able to get back to a 40-point score, but also can't play a full season, has really never really played a full season until a couple of years ago. And my thing with that now is, and the reason why I'm listing all this stuff out is because how can you trade someone like that? How do you necessarily pitch that to a team and say, hey, this is a salary dump. We'll give you a draft. I mean, really, with the way that the Lightning have made some deals. I mean, I hate to go back to it, but Tanner Jeannot trade and really not a lot of draft capital that is really enticing for the Lightning. What do you do? How do you go about a trade? And who is really going to take on his contract and give anything remotely back? Because if, unless the Lightning, which I know they're not going to do, and which I'm not advocating that they do, but they don't have a second round pick until 2026. And I can't imagine a team taking Conor Sheary in a deal, taking on $2 million. I don't care who it is, and not demanding even this year's 5th round, or maybe even the Edmonton pick for the 4th, or even a 3rd. I mean, if I'm a GM of an opposing team and the Lightning call me up and say, hey, I want to give you Conor Sheary, you take all the money and whatever, we'll take whatever. And that's the thing. That's the other thing that I'm having trouble with here, and I think a lot of Lightning fans don't realize. And I've talked about this with Tanner Jeannot, talked about it with other players on this team as well. If you're really so gung-ho, and I talked about it with Eric Chernak too, if you're so gung-ho on trying to get rid of a player, which is fine, that's going to be the new rule now, I would like to make on Locked on Lightning for all you listeners and watchers. If you comment or tweet to the show about getting rid of this player or that player, give me a trade deal or give me something that the Lightning could do to spice up the deal. Don't just say we're getting rid of this guy. That's it. Because I don't really see any NHL team, even Utah, who has had a history when they were in Arizona of just taking on salary, doing that. New ownership, new environment. Is really one of your moves in the offseason going to be taking on Conor Sheary and his $2 million a year for this year and next for a guy who really may not be able to crack a third line, who is quite frankly undersized and don't think it's going to be sustainable for him to play on the 4th for the long term? So in my opinion, the chances of the Lightning trying to figure out a deal for Conor Sheary, unfortunately, I think are very bleak. I don't really see anything out there, and that could very well change. That could very well change after the draft or even before the draft. But I don't see a scenario really in where the Lightning trade him away and they don't give up a little bit more than really they relatively should. So yeah, it's a little bit of a depressing situation, but it's still also the reality of the situation. And now we also got to think about, what if he does stay in Tampa Bay? We'll talk about that coming up in just a little bit. But first, we're going to talk about our last sponsor on today's show, and that is our new friends over at Ultimate Hockey GM. Now, hey, listen, Locked On Lightning fans, I want to take a moment to bring one of our partners, the mobile game Ultimate Hockey GM. Have you ever dreamed of becoming an NHL GM and managing your own hockey franchise? Do you think you could run the Lightning better than Julien Brisebois? Well, your dream can come true, and this game is most definitely for you. Manage every strategic aspect of your team, play through the seasons, and lead them to glory. Hire the right coaches, staff, and trade players for draft picks. navigate through free agency and the draft all in a challenging and realistic game world. As a Lightning fan, you know there is no offseason. GMs are constantly making moves at every point of the year to improve their team's chances. And that's why I think you are going to love this game. If you watched our Armchair GM episode or listened to it, you know I love doing stuff like this. And so I am already hooked on this game, and you can be too. So Ultimate Hockey GM is completely free and playable offline. Play on the go as you want and then when you want. By the way, Locked On NHL listeners get a 100% free boost to their franchise when using the promo code Locked On NHL in the game store. So make sure to check it out. Download the game. Just visit hockeygm.com or the App Store, or look it up on the App Stores. Hockey GM, start your dynasty today. So as always, one last time, I want to thank you all for making us your first listen of the day. If you haven't already done so, please go ahead and subscribe to the podcast. Give us a follow wherever podcasts are distributed in audio form. We're also available on YouTube. Subscribe to our channel there. Hit that notification button so as soon as the newest episodes drop, you'll be notified. And so we're rounding out our somewhat, I guess, not optimistic episode, but it's I don't want to be negative, but let's be honest. I mean, like I said, in what reality do the Lightning really are able not to get fleeced on a deal where they're able to give away Conor Sheary or even Tanner Jeannot? I mean, it's pretty much with any trade that you make for the players that you want to get rid of this offseason, you're really not going to get a return because all it is salary dumps. And that's the thing that really burns me up the most about all this. But nevertheless, we're looking at next season. And there is, I think, a very good chance. I would say, honestly, it's probably 60-40. 60 he gets traded, 40% he stays. But I think it's a very strong 40 that he stays. And if he does stay, what are the expectations there? And really, the only expectations I have for him, as well as I mean, if you want to go back and listen to the Tyler Mott episode that we did, it's kind of along the same lines of that. Stay healthy. Stay healthy. If we could get, like I said, 78 up until a couple of years ago was really the most games he played in a season. It took him 8 years to play 82 games in a season, which is just not something that, I think that a lot of people even realized. But when you're looking at him and you're trying to think about how he fits into this team, I think you really need to fit him or just have him on the bench because you can't scratch him. He's $2 million. And doing that is only going to tank his value even worse. And I think that really you could have him on the bench as like an extra forward. But really, you're not giving him third or fourth line minutes as much as you would really like. I mean, you can put him on the fourth line, but like I said before, he doesn't really have the frame or the size that I think to really play consistently fourth line minutes to where he's going to make a difference out there and not be a liability. I think that really the expectations for next year are if you could score 10 goals and play 80 games, then that's fine. I mean, it's not great, but it's fine. If he could somehow be able to play or have more of a broadened game, then I'm all for it. Bring him back and maybe he could expand his game, but I just don't see it. I just don't see where really he doesn't do more harm than good while being in Tampa Bay. So let me know in the comments below, what are your expectations for him for next season if he does indeed come back. And we will be sitting around with bated breath to see if the Lightning do, in fact, trade him this offseason. And like I've always said, you could find all the news, especially around that, here on Locked On Lightning. So go ahead and check us out. You can find more of my work over at boltsbythebay.com. So that's been it for this episode of Locked On Lightning, part of a Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Adam Danker. I'll talk to you in the next one.